Alright, in continuation with the same theme that we looked at with Hardin's article, we're going to look at Onora, I can't pronounce her name, Onora O'Neill's article, Lifeboat, Earth, which is going to address the same issues that Hardin's article dealt with, but is going to arrive at some vastly different conclusions than what Hardin arrived at. Just some review. Here's kind of a lifeboat. Blah, blah, blah. So, some stats. She's still alive. She's a British philosopher at University of Cambridge. And I think there's an important takeaway at the get-go, taking a bird's eye view of O'Neill's article. O'Neill and Hardin are both going to use the analogy of a lifeboat concerning the distribution, resource allocation, what to do with scarcity, and see how it applies to, human life. But their analogies are going to diverge in an important way. So the question is, how do their analogies differ? So, here's Hardin's lifeboat. It's a luxury yacht, the first worlders lifeboat. There's everyone clamoring to get on it, and you should just shoot them to keep them off. Do whatever it takes, because, So Hardin's metaphor, okay, that was a caricature of Hardin's argument, but I'm not sure if it's that extreme, but obviously it is. I guess someone would say it's a fairly extreme view. So Hardin's metaphor really suggests that the Earth is an ocean, and lifeboats are the first world affluent nations, and those in the affluent lifeboats should do whatever it takes to keep the poor sea people out. O'Neill's metaphor, on the other hand, though, suggests that the whole Earth is a lifeboat, and everyone, rich and poor, is on the lifeboat, but the lifeboat has limited resources, and currently not everyone has equal access to supplies. So here's my question. This is someone to think about for yourself. I don't have an answer to this question. I have thoughts, but it bears on the topic at hand. Who has the more accurate metaphor, O'Neill or Hardin? So, continuing this overview of O'Neill's article, O'Neill's going to argue from the assumption that persons have a right to not be killed unjustifiably, to the conclusion that we have a duty to prevent and postpone famine deaths. So like I said, the conclusion of O'Neill's article is very different from the conclusion of Hardin's article, who says he's making a case against preventing and postponing famine deaths, where O'Neill is going to argue that we actually have a duty to prevent it. So O'Neill's in line with Peter Singer. And again, this is an argument. And the key to the success of O'Neill's article is how she links these two claims, Claim 1 and Claim 2, what premises she uses, and whether or not those premises are true. So let's just get to it. She starts with this assumption of justifiable killing. So justifiable killing is not the same thing as murder. Murder kind of has its normative status built into the definition of it. It's intentional killing of the innocent person, perhaps. Actually, I don't have a precise definition of murder, but killing is not murder, though. I think we can agree with that. So the question is, and further assumption is, not all killings are justifiable. Not all killings are murder. And not all non-murder killings are all justifiable. Think of it that way. So what she's going to try to do is just kind of carve up the conceptual space, because this has moral implications, and kind of see when killing is justified. So like Peter's article, she has her assumptions, and she states them. Assumption 1, persons have a right not to be killed and a corresponding duty not to kill. I don't think many of us would disagree with that assumption, although it's going to have to be kind of specified perhaps, maybe some clauses added to it. So caveat, the right to not be killed can be justifiably overridden in certain circumstances. So the right to not to be killed, there can be you can have your right kind of overridden, in which case there would be a justifiable killing of you in two types of circumstances. One is unavoidable killings, and 2 is self-defense. So let's look at unavoidable killings first. Those occur in situations where a person doing some act causes some death or deaths he or she could not avoid. So going back to this example that I'm sure you're sick of, you're a train conductor on a high-speed rail going really fast, and there's someone on the tracks. Well, you can't slow down the train in time to get that person off the tracks, and there's no one around that can get that person off the tracks, so that's just, that person's going to die unavoidably. That, according to ONeill, would be a justifiable killing. It's tragic, it's unfortunate, we should lament it and mourn it and grieve it, but from a moral standpoint, it's, given that it's unavoidable, it's justifiable. So there's a second, more complicated type of unavoidable killing. That is the focus of ONeill's article. So a person B is the carrier of a highly contagious and fatal illness, and is in a situation thus that B cannot avoid meeting and killing either A or C, even though B can choose which of A or C he meets. So let's just say that that's B. B has got the zombie virus. So if you want to see World War Z or 28 Days Later or Zombie World or Zombie Land, so B has, whoever B comes in contact with gets infected. B has a little bit of free will left in his zombieified mind. He can kind of choose to go left or right, to go after the man or the woman or the boy or the girl or the adult or the child or whatever. But that's about it. And if you get in contact with B, you're going to be infected. So here's, B's got a choice between Phyllis and Creed. On ONeill's reasoning, that would be an well, first off, B's killing either A or B would be avoidable in a sense. B could avoid killing Creed by killing Phyllis, or avoid killing Phyllis by killing Creed, but B's going to kill someone. And this is a trickier case because it seems like there's a sense in which we have a kind of an assumption that neither killing would be justified. If B's gonna, like, B has to choose someone. I mean, couldn't B run off in the woods and avoid all human beings? By the way, that's Jim Halpert, zombified. So again, that's a complicated case. I don't want to go into too much more detail about it. But that's a case in which unavoidable killings may not be justified. All right, self-defense, though, we would say is a justified killing. And ONeill says a minimal right of self-defense is a corollary of the right to not be killed. So here's an assumption. If A has the right to defend himself against B, then third parties have a duty to defend A's right. So it's interesting how she can defend the link between what's between if and then what comes after then. So she says the right of self-defense extends to perpetrators who may not intentionally endanger our lives, such as someone infected, like Jim Halpert with the zombie virus, who doesn't even know it yet, even though you do. So, you find out your neighbor has been infected with the zombie virus, and in 24 hours, they'll be symptomatic, but they're infectious now. And if it comes down to kill or be killed, you have a justifiable right to kill that person. Well, this connects to Earth. How? We'll get to that. Remember, way at the beginning, she's going to argue from that premise, a right to not be killed unjustifiably, to the conclusion we have a duty to prevent and postpone famine deaths. So all this talk about zombies and self-defense, according to ONeill, and is going to bear on famine deaths. So it's worth getting to the lifeboat analogy then. That's my explanation for this segue, because it seems like we just jerk from this one topic about self-defense and these like weird hypothetical scenarios involving trains and zombies to suddenly we're talking about resource allocation and scarcity again. Huh? Okay, well, it'll make sense. So ONeill talks about two different types of lifeboats. Remember, Earth is kind of a lifeboat, on this analogy or metaphor. So it's worth, it just says there are different types of lifeboats. So it's worth seeing what they are and what Earth is. So the first type of lifeboat is a well-equipped lifeboat. On this type of lifeboat, provisions are sufficient for everyone aboard to survive until rescue. And I take this as the analog to the current Earth. And then there's poorly equipped lifeboats, where provisions are not sufficient for everyone aboard to survive until rescue. And this is like the analog to future Earth, given our current trajectory of climate change, population growth, so on, etc. So you'll notice your rights and your duties are going to change depending on what lifeboat you're on. So if you're on a lifeboat where there's enough resources for everyone, then you have a right to a certain quantity of water, for example. Whereas there isn't enough water for everyone. It's not obvious that you have a right to a certain amount of water. And the same applies with duties. You have a duty to, perhaps just not interfere with someone else's right to their fair share of water on a well-equipped lifeboat, and it's less obvious what you would do on a poorly equipped lifeboat, what your duty would be. So, depending on the actual situation and how many resources we have, our moral duties will change. And now, this isn't like a moral relativism. The same principles that dictate what we should do in the well-equipped lifeboat will, in some sense, apply to what we do on the poorly equipped lifeboat. So it's not like morality changes. It's more just like the application of these moral principles changes. Okay. So ONeill writes, and I quote, "If we imagine a lifeboat in which special quarters are provided for the recently first-class passengers, and on which the food and water for all passengers are stowed in those quarters, then we have a fair, if crude, model of the present human situation on Lifeboat Earth. For even on the assumption that there is at present sufficient for all to survive, some have control over the means of survival, and so indirectly over other survival." So, like I said, according to ONeill, Earth is a well-equipped lifeboat right now. There's enough resources for us to survive right now, even though some people control the means of survival and indirectly control the peoples. And that's true of Earth. People, wealthier nations, or nations sitting on top of valuable resources such as oil, in some sense, control indirectly others' access to that. And if those others countries depend on that for survival, then they control that too. If you depend on agriculture for your economic survival, you depend on gas for your agricultural equipment, but you don't have gas in your country, you don't have oil, then you're dependent on the countries that are oil rich or the countries that can refine oil. So, and this applies to other types of resources as well. But be that as it may, we have enough resources for all to go around right now. So, aboard a well-equipped lifeboat, any distribution of food and water that leads to a death is a killing and not just a case of permitting a death. So, that doesn't mean there aren't justifiable killings on a well-equipped lifeboat. It just means that that would not be a type of justifiable killing. That would be an unjustifiable killing. So, the analogies right now, and we read this in the preface to GJSE and I guess GESE, where as it stands right now, we have enough resources for everyone to prevent people dying from preventable diseases and from starvation. We have enough food to go around, and we have enough medicine for curable diseases to go around. It just so happens that those resources aren't fairly distributed. In fact, it wouldn't take that much of a shift from the top class. The billionaires wouldn't have to give up their yachts. It wouldn't take that much of a shift of resources to prevent all these avoidable deaths, like such as starvation and death from curable diseases. So, just like if you're on a lifeboat where there's enough food for everyone to go around, but someone dies because they somehow don't access to food or water, even though there is enough, that, according to ONeill, would be an unjustifiable killing. Okay. On poorly equipped lifeboats, some deaths will be unavoidable. It's not possible for all to survive. However, sometimes there is no particular person whose death is unavoidable. So read 2A through 2D on pages 6 through 7. She goes through those examples. There's no need for me to repeat that or rehearse that here. Okay. So, this leads to a distinction. And it's not a distinction that Onora ONeill has introduced, but it's a distinction she's utilizing. And it doesn't just apply to resource allocation and scarcity, or applies to a lot of different contexts. It's a distinction philosophers draw sometimes between killing and letting die. So let's just see how ONeill defines it. Killing is an act that is a cause of death that would not have occurred had the agent of the action had no causal influence or done another act. Letting die, on the other hand, one is allowed to die when their death would take place, all things being equal, unless some agent intervenes. So, an example of killing would be someone's in the hospital, they're sick, they're on their bed, and they need oxygen to breathe, but you inject a serum into their veins, and they peacefully fall asleep, and then they just don't wake up. By injecting the serum into their IV bags, for example, you would have killed them. Letting die, though, someone's in the hospital, and their lungs are shutting down, and the only means you could have for keeping them alive would be to supply them with an oxygen machine, but you don't. Okay, I came up with these examples on the spot, medical ethicists debate about each one, but its point is to see the distinction. So here's a question. Is a stowaway on a lifeboat killed or merely allowed to die if the stowaways divide food? Notice it doesn't say poorly equipped or well-equipped lifeboat. Well, think about that yourself. And read ONeill. She talks about it. Another question. It's a more obvious question. Actually, let me go back to that question real quick. Like I said, you got to distinguish one between a poorly equipped and well-equipped lifeboat. If it's a poorly equipped lifeboat, giving the stowaway food may be robbing food from someone else, so on, etc. Okay, another obvious question. What does ONeill mean by a sufficiency situation? Well, this is where you get an analogy with earth and property rights. By the way, I'm pulling up the structure of her article and I'm kind of hitting the main points. This lecture doesn't seem to flow as well as some of my other lectures. I apologize in advance, but this seems to be the best way to do it this time. So I'll quote ONeill. Many would claim that the situation on Lifeboat Earth is not analogous to that on ordinary lifeboats, since it is not evident that we all have a claim, let alone an equal claim, on the Earth's resources. Perhaps some of us are stowaways. I shall assume that even if persons have unequal property rights, and some people own nothing, it does not follow that R's exercise of his property rights can override A's right not to be killed. Here's an analogy. Suppose you have fresh water, and a person who's about to die of thirst stumbles onto your land and starts drinking out of your stream. If you forbid that person from drinking out of your stream, and so they die of thirst, basically your property right would be trumping that person's right to be killed, or at least you would make the judgment that your property right trumps that person's right not to be killed. ONeill's going to say that that is not justifiable. It doesn't matter what your property rights are, you have to give that person access to water. Okay, so she points into real-life situations in which economic activities, like the really simple example I just gave, do in fact lead to deaths, such as foreign investment situations, commodity pricings. And she goes into great depths about this. You can read that. But I just want to note that the thrust of her argument is that in both of those situations above, there are non-justifiable killings where the perpetrators do not act alone, the actions don't result in immediate death, it isn't certain if someone will die, and the deaths are not intended. So economic decisions can violate someone's right not to be killed even when satisfying A through D. Again, controversial claim, but maybe there's something to it, maybe there's not. So, the other takeaway from this section then on sufficiency situations is this. Someone might be killed in a situation of sufficient resources, like now, by the way, others have arranged the distribution of means of subsistence. So, for example, we have enough water for everyone to go around, but we've arranged it so that some people just don't have access to it, so they die of thirst. That can happen in sufficiency situations. It happens today. Now let's talk about scarcity situations. So we're going to talk about the poorly equipped lifeboats, the pool. This is situations that we might be facing in the future. It might be now. So I think globally we're in a sufficiency situation, but there's regional scarcity, just like there's regional overpopulation. And so like there's regional scarcity of water. Right now, Indiana is probably doing okay with water. We've gotten enough rain. Our aquifers keep getting recharged. The Southwest tends to not be doing as well as water. It's a desert for that reason. So there's a regional scarcity of water. There's also regional overpopulation and underpopulation. Again, there are, I guess you could say New York City is overpopulated. It reaches maximum capacity of population. Or again, parts in the Southwest, like New Mexico, that don't even have electricity because the population is so few and far between. So there's a sense in which population and scarcity is a regional thing, but there's also a sense in which it's a global thing, and we're gonna have to think of it that way, because perhaps climate change, perhaps overpopulation will make it a global thing, global overpopulation and global scarcity. So here's a scarcity situation, which could be now or could be in the future. Not everyone who is born in a scarcity situation can live out the normal span of human life. That's obvious. Causes would be, again, excess population, deficient natural resources like clean water, food, energy, or medicine. But the real issues she wants to address with respect to these scarcity situations is thus. 1. The question, are the deaths from the inevitable future famines killings? If yes, are they justified or unjustified? In other words, if there are inevitable future deaths from famines, are we now morally responsible for them, based on what we now do with our resources now? If so, what are we to do now? It's a tough question. It brings into the issue of a topic I had you address last week on the discussion boards. What are our moral obligations to future people that don't even exist now? There's a sense in which decisions we make now will impact the future. It will impact future people. Just like decisions persons made in the past impact us now. Like the Industrial Revolution brought lots of great technological change. It also brought lots of pollution. We didn't know any better. Automobile did the same thing, the use of oil. Decisions made 100 years ago are impacting us now. So what are our moral duties? These are tough questions. ONeill has some stuff to say about it, though. So, and I note, though, that the answers to these questions partially hinges on whether or not the impending famine is inevitable. So ONeill says, famine is said to be inevitable if people do not curb their fertility, alter their consumption patterns, and avoid pollution and consequent ecological catastrophes. So there's a sense in which famine, future famine, is preventable, and we are now morally responsible for it if it occurs, because we, in a sense, contributed to it. Okay, well, that's it for ONeill.